Hi, I'm Matt Larson. I have the honor and pleasure of serving you as the mayor of the city of Snoqualmie. Today I want to offer an update on what the city of Snoqualmie has been up to for the past year and what lies in the year ahead. But first of all, I'd like to introduce to you some of the new faces that are joining our Snoqualmie team this year, starting with Heather Munden, our new council member for position 5, replacing Maria Henriksen, who resigned recently. We also have a number of new officers that helps us meet our obligations for now serving the city of North Bend. Officer Bruton, Officer Goddard, Officer Hogan, Officer Vladis, and Officer Wilson. We also have a new city attorney replacing Pat Anderson, our former attorney, with Bob Sturbank, and a new fire chief replacing our former chief, Bob Rowe, with Mark Carrera. And replacing Mike Royer with our Public Works Operations Manager is Nancy Davidson, who comes with a wealth of experience, also having served on the Issaquah City Council. And then Janelle Knight and Jody Duran, also working with evidence and records up at the police department, now serving not just Snoqualmie, but the city of North Bend. And Ava Van, our new communications assistant, working with Joan Pliego. Every year, and I always like to take my city administrator and my finance officer, and we go to an economic forecasting conference held in Seattle, sponsored by the King County Seattle Economic Development Council. And every year they queue it up where they bring in speakers that look at things on a national or international global level, on a national level, and on a local regional level, with folks like Ken Goldstein and the former Michael Duker and Dick Conway. So Ken Goldstein's focus, or some of the highlights from his comments, was that 2014 was likely to be better than 2013 and 15, largely due to the fact that with interest rates now going up, there's been a backlog of demand from the housing market, and people are starting to flood back into the housing market. We anticipate an increase in housing prices and activity there, and then a leveling out again in 2015, in part because wages are not keeping up with the overall economic improvement. Michael Duker had similar points in that you've heard, many of us have heard in the papers recently, that we're going to continue to experience a long, slow economic expansion, but he was also very bullish on job growth. And the most optimistic of the three was perhaps Dick Conway, who emphasized that Seattle, the Seattle area in general has enjoyed an employment rate that's 1.5 times the size of 1.5 times the national average, in large part due to companies, strong companies that are doing well, like Boeing, Microsoft, and Amazon.com. So this is a forecast that's very useful for us as we sit down and start to prepare for our budgets and looking ahead for ourselves and what lies ahead. But we also, of course, look at our local data. And so some of the indicators locally is we're still experiencing some good steady growth since the recession in the last 4 years or so, as you can see up here. In the heyday of the growth of Snoqualmie Ridge, we were experiencing upwards of over 350 houses a year, almost a home a day in Snoqualmie. We're now been averaging in the last 4 years about 300 residents per year added to our population, which, as you see, in 2013 we were at 11,700, so now we're quite confident that when the numbers come out in June, we'll be over 12,000 for Snoqualmie. Some of the other factors out there is the single-family housing permits that were issued. You can see it's consistent here, where it's been a very long, steady, but very slow improvement in that market over the last 4 or 5 years. But we are seeing, as was forecasted by some of these folks back in January, a pretty big improvement in 2014 that we anticipate. Right now we're at 48 houses. As of compared to March of last year, we were at 33, so it's a 45% faster market, or more energized market than it was at this time last year. Looking at housing units sold overall in Snoqualmie, you see an even stronger trend upwards in the last 4 or 5 years, so again, a strong, slow recovery. Retail sales tax gives us a more mixed picture, and in part this is made more complex by a lot of one-time revenues from all the growth activity, which you can see in the last 4 years here we've been trying to glean out so that we're not building those revenues into our ongoing budgets and make sure that we have a sustainable budget when we reach full build-out. The blue here is the taxes largely from that were derived from the large project at the Snoqualmie Falls power plant rebuild. And also in the dark green, you see one-time revenues from a lot of the activity on the ridge. But regardless, when you glean those out in the last few years, you do see at least a trend that doesn't show anything alarming happening in the last 3 years. It's relatively stable or moving upward. In the business and operations tax areas, in terms of activity, we saw a dramatic increase up through or going down to 2011. That was less due to the recession, though, than it was due to losing some of our largest companies in Snoqualmie, or in the business part, such as the Optiva toothbrush company that slowly ramped down and eventually moved to China. And so we saw that decline here, and And then with the replacement of that, with Space Labs and Motion Sports and other large companies in the business park and several smaller ones, we've seen a marked improvement and a steady improvement now since 2011. And in fact, regardless of the change in businesses coming or going, overall in all sectors from professional, wholesale, construction, and manufacturing, we're seeing a net overall improvement, steady improvement in this sector as well. So again, some optimistic signs. And then lastly, in another sector, commercial sector out there in the hospitality industry, we're again since 2010 seeing a good, steady, strong improvement in that industry as well. So if I was to characterize or give a theme to what lies ahead in the next year, actually 3 years remaining on my current term, I would say it's prepare for landing. Snoqualmie Ridge took off on flight about 16 years ago. We've enjoyed a lot of great views out of the window and in-flight entertainment, but we're at that point in the flight right now where the flight attendant's basically saying, put your tray tables up and fasten your seatbelt, folks, and prepare for landing. Right now, the Snoqualmie Ridge, both phases 1 and 2, are approaching about approaching 90% build out. The business park has experienced about 75% build out, and we're anticipating a substantial or full build out by 2017. And in municipal or city terms, that's very quick, so we need to be laser focused on some of the turbulence that we anticipate ahead as we land. So 2 of the issues that I'm going to focus on today that pose some of the most significant challenges for us are twofold in our infrastructure. One is the Snoqualmie Ridge infrastructure and the downtown infrastructure. And they're really quite different in character, what challenges they pose for us. On Snoqualmie Ridge, although a lot of folks think that Snoqualmie Ridge is still quite new, much of the backbone of the infrastructure that was put into Snoqualmie Ridge is now approaching 17 years old. And much of the early stages of that maintenance that's going to be required is grind and overlays of surface streets. And that has to be paid for out of a general fund, and so it puts pressure in the general fund. And the downtown infrastructure, much of that infrastructure downtown, all of the utilities underground and the roads are in excess of 50 to 60 years old. They've largely more than outlived their useful life. They're in a state of failure and really need to be largely rebuilt. But because there's utilities underground that can be rebuilt, the surface streets can be done, all that can be done with utility funds. And so that will put a great deal of pressure on our utility funds. And I'll get back to these in more detail in a moment. So to explain that, to make sense of when I talk general fund or enterprise funds, there's essentially two areas or buckets that the state law requires a city to separate its operations in. One is what's called the general fund, and this is what most folks understand or see of their city day to day, and it's everything with police officers, fires, your parks, your planning, your building administration, all the attendant capital that goes to service those, whether it's the buildings, the equipment, and the vehicles required for each of those departments. And they all are essentially defined as general fund, and they're sustained by general tax revenues such as property taxes, sales taxes, utility tax, or a tax on utilities, and that helps to operate all those. The monies that we derive to support those are unrestricted. They can be used in all city operations. On the other side of that equation is what we call the enterprise funds. Enterprise funds are kind of what they imply, a business enterprise. They're treated, we're effectively providing a product or a service, a product such as water that we deliver to a business or a home, or a service such as taking sewer from that home and business and treating it properly. And so by virtue of that, it's essentially, these are functions of the city operations that are sustained by fees, not taxes, a fee charged for a service rendered. And they include, of course, all the utilities, the water, the storm, the sewer, and the irrigation, all the personnel connected with that, and the infrastructure. Last year, I focused a lot on the pressures that were really challenging the general fund for the last couple of years. Mainly things like the cap on property tax initiative with I-747, the Tim Eyman initiative that was passed back in 2001, that restricted our ability to do increases on property taxes by 1% per year, which didn't allow us to effectively keep up with the cost of living. That was largely rectified with the levy lid lift that was successfully passed by you in Snoqualmie a year and a half ago. And so what I want to do now is turn my attention this year on what all the challenges are for the enterprise fund or the utility side of this equation. The one anomaly, however, in the enterprise fund is the area called streetscape. By state law, we're not allowed to treat a street and its other amenities as a piece of, like a utility. It's effectively, its burden comes, all the funding for improving a street has to come out of the general fund. And so that is one anomaly that creates some unique challenges in our budgets here. So to delineate that piece of the infrastructure, the streets, just to give you an idea, In Snoqualmie, we have over 42 centerline miles of streets. That's effectively building a street, like having a street from City Hall downtown all the way to the Glass Museum in downtown Tacoma. We have 72 miles, or 71 miles of sidewalks. That's equivalent to a sidewalk from here to 3 miles south of Olympia, nearly hitting the Tumwater. And 100 trees, which about 6,000 of those are along our streets, and mostly along the streets, others in the parks and other general areas. And 29 miles of trails, of which at least a third of those are along the streets, like the Parkway. On the enterprise infrastructure, starting with water, we have 54 miles of pipe on Snoqualmie Ridge that is now approaching in excess of 17 years old. 10 miles of pipe in historic downtown Snoqualmie, which is in excess of 60 years old, which means it's well beyond its useful life. In fact, the technologies used in those days were old concrete asbestos pipes that usually had a life range of about 40 to 50 years. And they're well beyond that life. 7 pump stations, 5 reservoirs, and 6 water sources, such as wells and springs that need to be maintained. With sewer and irrigation, we have 33 miles of pipes at the Snoqualmie Ridge, again approaching 17 years old, 10 miles in the historic Snoqualmie, in excess of 50 years old, 14 pump stations, 1 treatment plant, and that treatment plant produces water which services 12 miles of mainline irrigation pipe, which irrigates the TPC golf course and all the main city parks up on Snoqualmie Ridge and a lot of the landscape mediums along the main streets. And lastly, stormwater, which is 70 miles of pipe, 4,500 drains, 54 storm ponds, 12 bioswales and rain garden features, 5.3 historical downtown pipe miles that are in excess or approaching 47 years old. So you can see it's a rather substantial investment in infrastructure and challenge, even though Snoqualmie is a relatively small community. A good example that illustrates some of the challenges in the distinction of downtown infrastructure is one of the first projects we did paid for entirely by Snoqualmie funds, which is a $4.2 million project that we did on what we call some of the Greek streets downtown, which was Cedar Street over by the school superintendent's office and some of the streets over here by the high school. That was Cedar Falls, Beta, Indiana. You can see here's a shot right by the bus barn by the superintendent's office on Cedar Street. You can see that this gives good illustration of the state of the pavement. It's full of alligator cracking. There's more pothole patches than there is actually pavement. You see ditches that were dug in for pipe improvements. Ponding that's going on from lack of storm drains. In some cases, there might have been curbs and storm or gutters put into these streets years ago, but due to a poorly constructed base and subsequent overlays, those curbs have effectively disappeared underground. You see a lot of cracked up sidewalks. This is actually one that's in better shape compared to many downtown. But all in all, when you see a surface of a street like this, it's an indication that not only the surface layer has failed, but the base layer has failed as well, and the street needs to be completely rebuilt. It also is indicative of the other utility infrastructure underground with all the pipes of the storm, water, and sewer, that they are in a very poor state of repair as well. Here's an example of the street after it was rebuilt. You can see it's a substantial improvement. Here's an example of Falls Avenue, looking down Falls south toward the car wash at the end of the street. There's a blue house in the corner. Note this fence on the right. Again, similar kind of circumstances of lack of good drainage and poorer streets that are on the verge of failure and so forth. And here's an after shot with, again, the fence here on the right. Here's the blue house looking south toward the car wash right here. Here's another shot on Epsilon Street looking back toward Falls. You see that same blue house on the corner, except this is looking west back toward Falls. You see significant pond in the street. Again, lack of good storm drainage. Very, very poor state of repair that the street is in. And as a reference point, you see the staircase over here by the preschool to the right. Here's the after with the same staircase, and again, a considerable improvement. So we've had some great successes downtown. A lot of it, which has been largely invisible, that folks have not had the advantage of seeing, such as the reconstruction of 3 sewer lift stations, complete rebuild of those stations, and one of our main water wells, along with a treatment facility located over by the track at the high school site. You can see in the blue marked areas here, here's the projects we did with the Greek streets and the recent rebuilds. Where the dashed lines are is where there was a complete rebuild of River Street and Park Street. Some years ago, it went all the way out to past the elementary school to Centennial Fields. We finished phase 1 of the downtown rebuild on Falls Avenue and a portion on the east side of Railroad last year, and we are now going to embark this June on a reconstruction from First Street down past River Street in the downtown as well. So considerable progress, and but in excess of $30 million that's been invested to date. What we're looking in the in the next several years is to try and tackle what you see highlighted in this gold-yellow color here of all these other remaining streets to completely rebuild those. And we're looking to pursue about $33 million for infrastructure overall, of which about $23 million, or more than 2/3 of that, would be allocated or targeted for these streets downtown. So the question would be, why? Why would we expend that kind of money and go to that point? Why not take this at a slower pace? So there's a philosophical or best business practice approach of whether we want to be in a reactive or proactive mode, as I would describe it. So an example of a good reactive mode would be a project that sort of unexpectedly threw itself upon us about last month. The crew went and turned off the water line over on 384th to do some regular maintenance work on it. And after they were done with the maintenance, they turned the water line back on, and the pipe burst in 6 different places, which resulted in an emergency repair that spilled into the weekend, costing time and a half and sometimes double overtime with the crews. The cost in that project went upwards of $12,000. It worked out to about $200 per linear foot for 60 feet of pipe. And at the end of the day, it's a very inferior fix because the system is still inadequate. It's on the verge of more failures. There could be other utilities that break down next to it that within several months or next year could require the same area to be dug up again to repair a sewer line or some other piece of the utility. So it's a half fix at most, or at best. The other approach is twofold. We could be more proactive about it. We could take that very same project, put it out for bid, and do a more planned approach to that. And if we estimated in this same project, had we done that, the cost would be less than half at $5,700 or about $95 per linear foot. And then lastly would be the more ideal way, or the best management practice, and that would be to rebuild all the utilities at once, and which also would allow us to redo the pavement at the same time and pay for those other utilities. And this would be an estimated 3 to 4 times less, and would give a new life to all the infrastructure of another 50 to 75 years, so that you know it was fixed right and fixed considerably less, or more cheaply. So knowing that, one of the conclusions is, well, first of all, what's the reality? We are one city, and whether folks feel that we're tied together or not, there isn't anything to indicate on the horizons that somehow Snoqualmie is going to fragment or succeed, or any parts are going to break off from the other. So if we accept the reality that we are one community, we are subsequently all tied to the liabilities and potential costs of maintaining each other's infrastructure. So the next question then begs itself, well, what would be the best way to do that? What's the best approach? And of course, our conclusion, it would be far wiser to eventually get to a statement where the target, the goal, would be that we could say all of our infrastructure is in a state of proactive maintenance, not reactive, so that we can attend to these costs in a far more responsible and far more cost-effective manner. So how do we get there? Well, one thing, several years ago, we didn't even have a full sense of just what the scope of the problem was. We started to put cameras down into water and sewer lines, sent trucks along every street in Snoqualmie, bouncing sonar off the streets to get a very detailed picture of just what was the condition of the pavements, what was the life left on that pavement, and the same with all the pipes. And once we had all that data, we could identify all the deficiencies and start laying that on a timeline for the next 60, even 20 years, and identify when certain streets or parts of the infrastructure would need maintenance, start putting some estimated costs connected with that, and start brainstorming how would we find revenues. And it comes in a more challenging environment where both on a federal and state level, we're increasingly finding that because of the dysfunctions at those levels, we're having increasing less access to grants and funding. And so again, the challenge has been made greater in that regard. And then we recommend some sort of rate increases, particularly in utilities, and then look at a plan for implementing that. Of course, what informs that plan too are some fundamental values, what we would call conservation, equity, stability, and standards. On the conservation side of the equation, it's kind of twofold. One is a less voluntary measure where we have mandates from the federal or state governments for things like the National Pollution Elimination Discharge System that requires us to raise the bar on what can be, what sort of runoff from chemicals or oils on the streets or other neighborhoods that can go into storm drains and eventually get to the rivers and Puget Sound. And so we have to abide by a lot of those standards and requirements. We also have things like inflow and infiltration, where I think most folks are concerned about what might leak out of a sewer pipe into the ground. And it's actually quite the opposite. The leakage happens the other direction, where we would get rainwater and groundwater that would leak into our sewer system and head to our plant. And then at great cost, we're treating a lot of fluid that is unnecessary to treat, so we're not conserving our resources and using that system in the best way. So the more we can minimize and mitigate inflow and infiltration, again, it's more conservation and better use of our resources. And then the Gene Hansen Park that's soon to be built, next community park, is a good example of another kind of conservation where it's how can we avoid ways of using the resource in the first place. We worked with the home developer to convert those fields essentially to artificial turf from a grass field, which is going to eliminate the need to expend tens of thousands of gallons of potable water irrigating those fields every year, which will no longer be needed. And then stability is a rather obvious one. We want to project out and look ahead on all of our costs and liabilities with this system and make sure that we're providing resources and revenue to adequately maintain it in a proactive fashion, again, to make this a very sustainable system for a high quality of life that I think most Snoqualmie residents expect and demand. And then lastly is standards. This becomes a tough one, particularly in neighborhoods downtown where we might have a great mix of standards. One neighborhood you go into might have curbs and gutters or storm drains, and others lack that. So in order to avoid arguments and debates that would go on for decades about people saying, hey, I'm paying the same rates and utilities, but what I'm provided for a service or for infrastructure is considerably less or more than someone else, we're starting to look at how can we create more uniform standards throughout the city so that we can mitigate and lessen any of those issues. And then, where do we want to set the bar for quality? And coming out of all that, our conclusion was one that, after all these studies, that our current rates as compared to many of our peers are extraordinarily low, and that we would need to increase our utility rates in all 4 utilities and increase that for a few years. So what that looks like for 2014, what's being proposed is for residential rates in water, sewer, and storm, you can see it would be about 6.75% increase in water, 7.5% in sewer, and 17% in stormwater. And although 17% looks like a rather shocking number because the stormwater fee is not huge to begin with, it only amounts to a $2.11 per customer increase. So when you combine all these costs together, when we look at 2014, we're looking at increases of $6.50 in 2014, $8.25 in 2015, and a little over $9 in 2016. The good news is that because there was inadequate analysis of all the issues I've described in the past, there were past councils over a decade ago that often froze our utility rates and didn't increase them. They were often just looking at what the current expenses were rather than the long-term infrastructure issues or moving toward a proactive state. And so our fees as compared to other communities really went quite low. So we have a lot of capacity for increasing. You can see on the bottom here, this is Snoqualmie's current utility rate, and even with the increase of some $6+ or $6.50, we would be at the bottom of the comparable communities of Snohomish, Carnation, Duval, Monroe, North Bend, Issaquah, and Redmond. On the commercial side of the equation, we've tried to compare this by looking at some of the different user classes, such as a restaurant, a multifamily unit, some government entities like the elementary school or the hospital, and then see what those rates would do there. You see our current rate is in the green here, and the proposed increase is in the light brown. Basically, it's an average. The spread goes between 7 to 18% average increases. The average is 12% overall, with a spread of about 7 to 18%. And these are the combined rates of all the utilities combined, with the exception of irrigation. However, the good news, even in the commercial rates, is as we compare ourselves to like communities, particularly the 4 communities of Issaquah, North Bend, Carnation, Redmond, and Duval, we can see that our rates are considerably less. What I've done here is basically taken, let's take the hospital, for example. We take the current rate, which you see the proposed rate, even with the increase, which you see in the light brown here on the hospital, and then we took that same water usage from the hospital and said, well, hey, if we went into, say, the city of Issaquah and used their rate formulas with that same water usage, what would their rate be? And we came out with a number from that community. We did that with each of the 5 communities, and then added all those numbers to come up with an average for those communities, and then compared that to our increased rate. And you can see here, even with those combined averages from the other communities, we are as much as 50% less than many of those combined communities. In the case of the hospital, it was 24% less. Basically a spread of about approximately 34% average less cost than overall. So at this point, this proposal to increase the rates was introduced to the City Council on May 12th. It will be again considered, or by the time you see this, it's probably already been considered on the 27th again, and will likely even go as far as June 9th. So I encourage folks, if you see this before that time, to get down and make your concerns and opinions known. But hopefully this has given you more of a background to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish. Just a few more other highlights that have been going on in Snoqualmie in the months ahead, and what's already been done in the months past is when we're ready to start up our phase 2 in Snoqualmie Ridge. I'm just going to show you a map here real quick to show you where some of these projects are. This is where phase 2 is downtown, a new restaurant down there. We have the Global Rally Cross at the mill site, the improvements with the power plants at the falls, the Boeing Classic at TPC and Snoqualmie Ridge, a new business coming into the business park, apartment complex coming in over, at the corner of Swenson and the Parkway, Jeannie Hansen Park, and the new Snoqualmie Valley Hospital. So a little more detail on those. We have these renderings online if you want to see them in more detail, some beautiful concepts of what we would do from River Street to First Street is the second phase of the Snoqualmie Ridge. The downtown phase 2 rebuild. It's a $5.2 million project, fully funded, and is ready to start on June 9th, and we estimate it will be completed in May of 2015. And this will completely rebuild the west side of the Railroad Avenue downtown, all in front of the Railway Museum, and it should considerably improve the entire aesthetic and make it a much more beautiful and inviting environment. Here again is a shot of the area right across from the depot. We were disappointed to lose the La Fogata restaurant recently, but then we're pleased to hear that a new restaurant came in quickly after them called Ray's Dining Car and Bar, which is kind of nice that they're also building that theme on the railroad. And I think most people are aware of this very large project that's going on for the last 3 or 4 years with PSE rebuilding the power plants 1 and 2. That project is now largely wrapped up. What most folks probably are unaware of is this hidden treasure with the new parking facilities at the lower part of the falls that now gives quick and easy access into the boardwalk at the bottom of the falls. In the business park, we are welcome to introduce, or happy to welcome a new company, a new water sports company called Square One. They produce the Rodex wakeboards and the Radar water skis. They are currently building, they have a very similar product and model as Motion Sports. You can see the Motion Sports buildings here, which is on the Parkway, right where Fairway meets Parkway. And similar to Motion Sports, they produce everything that you basically pull behind a watercraft, a recreational watercraft, from inflatables, wakeboards, skis, and so forth. They're looking to start with about 25 and eventually build about 50 employees in this facility. 75,000 square foot facility. You can see under construction here next to the Venture Park. Similar to Motion Sports, they've integrated their distribution center and assembly center along with the corporate and research and development components into this one location. Just a little further up the Parkway at the corner of Swenson and Parkway, again, this is 100-unit Woodlands development for luxury townhomes, a product that we very much need more of, rental apartment type products. So in this, we're anticipating that they would be out for sale coming this summer. And then we also are pleased that we're well underway with the construction of our 3rd community park in Snoqualmie Ridge. With we anticipate here by the end of the summer the completion of the Jeannie Hansen Community Park located up off Jacobia off the Parkway. This will include 2 full-size soccer fields and a football field. And what was interesting in this project is, again, I mentioned this earlier about conservation, where we concluded that the community would be much better served with 3 times the play time by converting these into artificial turf fields. We worked with the developer to do that, where the city of Snoqualmie came to the table and contributed upwards of close to $1 million to make sure that we could raise the bar and make this a much more accessible and useful facility for the city. And part of doing that was taking some value out of the 3rd field, the football field, and we thought we would have to leave that sitting until we found future funding. Fortunately, the Snoqualmie Valley Youth Soccer Association stepped up with a $160,000 grant and said that they would be willing to partner with us to help get that football field built. So we're happy to announce that all 3 of those fields will be built and completed by the end of the summer. You can see that currently they're ready to roll the grass out in those fields, so they're really well underway. We anticipate celebrating a grand opening this September, and in fact, because the mayor, this park is named for the mayor who started the Snoqualmie Ridge over 16 years ago, and we thought as we're approaching full build-out that this was a wonderful opportunity to sort of bring that legacy full circle and honor Jeannie Hansen's legacy as we did a grand opening of this park. So mark it on your calendar, or keep your eye out for a date certain here soon to celebrate that. The hospital, as you can see, is well underway out there near the on the road to the Echo Glen facility. And then I'm happy to see that we have two nationally and internationally televised events coming up here soon. We have the return of the Global Rally Cross down at the mill site. That will be take place on September 27th of this year and broadcast on NBC on Sunday, September 28th. And then it's a really special year for the Boeing Classic. They're celebrating the 10-year anniversary And we've been really privileged and honored to host them for the past decade, and I look forward to celebrating that with them this summer. And so with that, and with your support, I'm glad to report that Snoqualmie remains vibrant and strong. Thank you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me or city staff. Have a good day.